and welcome to another Cost Harmonious video series. My name is Robert, and today I'll be guiding you through some of the pre-processing stages for UAV-based image velocimetry. Specifically, we'll be discussing three topics: geometric correction, video stabilization, and orthorectification. And during this presentation, I'll try to explain what these steps aim to do and what effects can they have. And afterwards, I'll also be going through a step-by-step hands-on example on using one of the tools developed by this cost action, so stick around to the end of the video. So, what do the three aforementioned terms mean in relation to the UAV videos? Simply put, geometric corrections involve identification and digital removal of camera imperfections, whether they are related to the camera sensor or the lens. Video stabilization involves compensation of camera motion relative to the ground to provide a fixed coordinate system for velocimetry analysis. And finally, orthorectification aims to establish the relations between the image space and the real world. So let's start by explaining these terms from the beginning then. Before we begin, I need to introduce the term geometric distortion, which covers a broad group of visual issues where the most prominent ones are radial distortion, where the field of view distorts in a pincushion or barrel-like shape, causing a loss of collinearity in captured images; tangential distortion, which is caused by the misalignment of the camera sensor and the lens, so certain areas of the image will appear larger or smaller than other areas relative to their real-world relationships. And finally, perspective distortion is a mix of various effects such as position of object in the camera frame, camera angle, and so on. We'll start from the beginning by first reviewing the effects of the radial distortion. So such radial effects are caused by the camera lens when information is unevenly distributed on the camera sensor. This is more common with inexpensive cameras and lenses, but so-called wide-angle cameras intentionally employ such effects in order to store as much information as possible in the video. However, these effects are quite detrimental when we use videos to estimate physical parameters such as position and velocity. For example, straight trajectories of the tracer particles would appear arched and the resulting velocities will be incorrect. Tangential distortion is a somewhat simpler effect which appears when the lens and the camera sensor planes are not parallel to each other. This in turn leads to a so-called projective type deformation, and some images will appear bigger than they actually are in relation to other image areas. Most of us have probably seen these effects in action in our car rearview mirrors, which basically act like reflector lenses. Good thing is that modern camera manufacturing process is far more precise than it used to be, and such effects are often small or even negligible, but the intensity of this distortion still needs to be estimated and, if need be, compensated for. And final geometric issue is one that is quite difficult to completely avoid, called perspective distortion. In short, due to the focal nature of our cameras, it is impossible to achieve a complete orthogonal view of the region of interest. So the same object in the center and in the edges of the camera frame will look differently. For example, the image on the left is taken with the camera directly above the truck, while the image on the right is the same area, but when the UAV and the camera have panned to the left. This effect can often be observed with topographic relief, where the same object will appear to be of different size and shape on hills and in the valleys. The effect is somewhat reduced when the camera is in their orientation and with increasing height of the UAV, but is very difficult to completely eliminate. We'll discuss some of the available mitigation strategies when we consider orthorectification procedures in the following sections. So, what information do we exactly need in order to reverse all of the aforementioned geometric distortions? As it turns out, we need three pieces of information. We need to estimate the so-called camera intrinsics matrix, which contains the focal length and the principal point coordinates. We need to know the amount and type of radial distortion, which is usually expressed using 2 or 3 coefficients, and we need to know the two tangential distortion coefficients. And estimation of these parameters is most commonly referred to as camera calibration and usually involves the use of a specific target system like a checkered board. Instead of demonstrating the entire camera calibration process, which is described in detail in literature and in online tutorials, I wish to direct you to some of the most popular software and tools that can do that for you. For example, there's a very capable and user-friendly camera calibration toolbox in MATLAB, along with a free alternative written for Octave. If you're familiar with Python or C++, you can check out a powerful OpenCV library, or if you're also involved or invested in photogrammetry, you'll likely find Agisoft Metashape to your liking, as it can do both of these things simultaneously. However, it's also worth keeping in mind that some of the tools developed specifically for UAV velocimetry are preloaded with parameters of certain popular UAV cameras, and you can use them without the need for any additional user involvement. In our hands-on example at the end of the presentation, we'll show one of such tools. Finally, I'll give a few rather general recommendations and advices in order to help you improve your camera calibration results. First one is that you should try to perform the calibration in controlled environment in order to eliminate any external factors. You should be aware that the camera intrinsics will change with the image resolution, so you should use the same resolution during calibration and in the field, although there are some procedures that can circumvent this issue. You should also know that if you use zoom on your camera, you will effectively change the focal length and thus the intrinsics matrix. To minimize the perspective distortions, keep the camera in a deer orientation if possible, and keep the region of interest in the center of the camera frame. Finally, some modern cameras, especially the high-end models, create very low amounts of distortion. Camera calibration can even be omitted from the workflow, although you should always check to make sure that this is justified. Moving on, we'll discuss the issue of video stabilization. As much as modern UAVs are becoming more stable, if you've ever taken videos with them, you've probably noticed an amount of residual motion even when the platform is hovering. In short, there are many systems inside the UAV engaged to keep the flight steady, and even in hover mode, the platform is tirelessly performing calculations to compensate for wind conditions, positioning errors, etc., doing its best to stay in a certain spot. For velocimetry purposes, stability of the UAV and the resulting video is extremely important, as it reduces the overall impact of the camera motion on the final results. So how do we identify and compensate for such motion? The workflow usually goes as follows. We look for static objects, or features as they're commonly called in videos, and aim to use them to identify camera motion. These are usually ground control points, buildings, rocks, or anything similar. We look at how these objects move in the video, and finally, we use that movement information to digitally reverse the camera motion and provide a stable, constant coordinate system. Some might notice that the workflow is quite similar to the image velocimetry, except that instead of tracers, we follow these static features. Now, almost all stabilization algorithms work in the described way, but the main thing that can differentiate them is the way these static features are selected and tracked. One approach is to select these features manually and let the algorithm track them throughout the video, while some algorithms aim to automatically select a large number of potentially stable features and later determine which ones are actually stable. And now both approaches have their own pros and cons. Manual approach requires a level of user experience and more user input, but can prove to be more robust if the flight and ground conditions are quite complex. However, automatic approach requires less user involvement, as there are usually just a couple parameters, but some conditions might cause these algorithms to fail to adequately stabilize the video. Now I would like to show you the effects of video stabilization. Video on the left is the original unstable sequence taken during a field campaign on the Senta River in Italy, where UAV appears to be quite unsteady, panning left and right periodically. The video on the right, however, is the stabilized sequence where our region of interest, the water surface, stays perfectly still the entire time, and you can see how the algorithm moves the original camera frame around in order to compensate for the motion of the camera. There's also an interesting detail on the right riverbank of the stabilized video, where a small amount of perspective distortion can be noticed as the water surface and the riverbank have slightly different elevations, and the UAV is flying quite low. There are even some extreme applications of video stabilization, for example, using handheld smartphone videos, such as in this one. So it's quite clear that the same algorithmic principles extend far beyond UAV application. As before, I'll leave a few advices and tips on how to achieve good stabilization results. The most obvious advice is don't move your UAV if you don't have to and leave it in hover mode. Also, leave the camera in a deer orientation and avoid oblique shooting angles if possible. You should remove as much geometric distortion from the video as you can before you start stabilizing. Make sure that there are enough static features for the algorithm to work, especially once close to the water surface. Each stabilization method has a minimal and recommended number of features to work with, so make sure that you follow such recommendations. Avoid using features that are collinear, clustered in a small area, or that differ in elevation between them. It's best if they are at the water level and as close to the water as possible. And finally, if no natural static features can be found, artificial ground control points are your friends and will help you even in the most complex conditions. It's important to understand how cameras register objects in their field of view, especially how the flat sensor captures non-flat objects such as terrain. If we take a look at a number of points on the ground, that visual information reaches the camera sensor radially through a so-called focal point. The distance between the sensor and the focal point is referred to as the focal length. Since the camera sensor is flat, the information about points at different elevations cannot be perceived correctly, so this in turn causes a non-uniform scaling of the real-world information on the sensor. Instead of perceiving the point locations correctly, their positions will contain a certain degree of error. The red arrows on the figure indicate the correct positions that the points should take on the camera sensor, while the black points at the bottom indicate their actually perceived positions. These errors will increase with the increase of the height differences in the image. However, the errors also increase significantly if the camera is not facing the terrain in a deer orientation, as you can see in this image here. In short, the orthorectification process aims to turn this perspective view of the camera into a so-called orthographic view with uniform horizontal scale. So how can this be achieved? There are two groups of methods for this purpose, non-parametric and parametric. Non-parametric methods use in-image and real-world coordinates for a number of points and perform projective transformation between those two coordinate systems. Parametric methods, on the other hand, are a bit more complicated. They use information on both internal camera parameters and the external orientation of the camera, along with a digital elevation model or digital surface model. Now, it's not hard to understand why the simpler non-parametric approaches of limited accuracy can usually be properly applied only to a smaller image area. However, the parametric approach is far more complex and requires more input data, but if such data is readily available, it can provide highly accurate results. So what can we do to improve the orthorectification accuracy? As before, keep the camera in a deer orientation if possible, as this minimizes the aforedescribed positional errors. Use of artificial GCPs is again highly recommended, especially if you can position them as close to the water surface as possible. There are also benefits of using additional GCPs at different elevations than the water surface to provide additional data for orthorectification algorithm. However, If you have a digital elevation model or digital surface model at your disposal, parametric approach will provide far better accuracy. But if you only have rudimentary data, a couple of ground control points and a non-parametric method will usually suffice for image velocimetry on flat water surface. Now that we've gone all the way through explaining what these pre-processing steps do, we can easily summarize what would happen without such steps and why are they so important for image velocimetry. So, without geometric corrections, we'll be left with errors in perceived trajectories of tracers and velocity vector values and their real-world positions. Without video stabilization, we would have a constantly shifting image coordinate system with no way to separate the real tracer values from the camera motion. And finally, without orthorectification, it would be very difficult to relate the image to the real-world information and provide meaning to our velocimetry results. After all that theory, I'd like to present something more practical and will complete a hands-on example that you can follow along. The tool I'll be using for this purpose is called SIMS and is equipped with capabilities for dealing with everything that we've discussed so far. You can download the latest version from GitHub and you'll need Python 3 with few additional libraries. The tool can be used either as a bare Python in a terminal, but it's far easier to use it with an available graphical interface for Windows, which I'll be doing today. For application on Linux or Mac OS, you'll want to follow the instructions on the tool's GitHub homepage. Our hands-on example begins at the GitHub repository of the SIMS tool. Here you can find all the information about the tool, along with the lengthy README text which serves as an instructions manual. Detailed instructions on how to install and use the tool can be found there as well. The thing we need right now for our tutorial is the latest release of the tool, which can be accessed by clicking on the releases link on the right panel. In the moment of this video's making, the latest version is 0302. You can download it as a zip file by clicking on the link below, which I've already done, and I've also unpacked the zip archive. You can unpack this zip file anywhere you want on your computer. Another thing we'll need is an example video for us to pre-process. When you unpack the zip file, you'll find a folder labeled examples, which contains a file example1 PDF. In the PDF, you can find a description of a video taken using a DJI Mini 2 drone, along with a download link. I've already gone ahead and downloaded the video for us. Now we have everything we need in order to complete this tutorial, so let's get started. The executable file of the tool is located in the GUI folder and has an exe extension. By opening the executable, you'll be greeted by the main form of the SIMS tool, from which you can access all its functionalities. If you have Python 3 installed and listed in the Windows path variable, the tool will automatically locate it and list the Python version in the lower left corner of the form. If this does not happen for you, please refer to the installation instructions in the README section on GitHub. The tool also needs some additional Python libraries, which are all listed in the README file. You can install them using pip, but they are often already contained in Python distributions such as WinPython and Anaconda, with the possible exception of the OpenCV library. Our workflow will start by unpacking the video into individual frames. We can do that by clicking on the button in the top left corner of the main form. In the newly opened window, we'll start filling the information from the top by first selecting the video file by browsing to its location and clicking Open. We can notice that the video metadata has been loaded for us to inspect. If we want to perform geometric corrections on the original images, we'll need to define camera parameters. This tool comes prepared with a set of camera parameters for some popular UAVs, which we can choose from a drop-down list. Here, we'll choose DJI Mini 2, which is the UAV used for the acquisition of our example video. You'll notice that the camera parameters have now been loaded in the boxes below, and if we click Apply, the form will indicate that the camera parameters have been selected for DJI Mini 2. Below, we can choose to define the number of other parameters, which I will leave at their default values for now. except I will not unpack the entire video since the first 30 seconds or so contain a very low amount of camera motion. I will deselect the unpack entire video checkbox and pull the upper slider to 30 seconds to indicate the starting point for the unpacking. Finally, by clicking the button in the lower right corner, the unpacking will begin and we'll be able to track the progress in the terminal window. Once the unpacking has completed, the previous form will automatically close, and some of the information, such as the name and location of the frame's folder, extension of the frame files, video frame rate, etc., will also be automatically loaded into the main form. Tool will also assume that you'll want the results of the processing to be stored next to the frame folder in a folder labeled stabilization, which you can change to your liking. We can also inspect individual frames by clicking the little button to the left of the frames folder box and use the slider to choose the frame number. The next step in the workflow is to identify and select static features to detect and quantify camera motion. I will leave the parameters on the left-hand side of the main form, such as the interrogation area and the search area sizes, at their default values. These values will be adequate for 95% of the situations, but you can learn more about them in the README section on GitHub. We can also notice that the Track Features button is enabled because the tool has found 448 frames in the selected folder. By clicking on the Track Features button, we'll be greeted by a window asking us to select our static features. In this window, we can use P and O on the keyboard to pan and zoom the image, and we can also undo these actions using the left key. We can select the static features by clicking on their location with the right mouse button, but if we accidentally make a mistake, we can remove the last selected feature using the D key on the keyboard or clicking the middle mouse button. I will do that now for the 4 features presented by the 4 ground control point markers on the riverbanks. The reason we've selected these 4 features is that at least 4 features are required for some image transformation methods. However, for a later demonstration, I will also select one random feature, let's say one on the river surface here, and if we're happy with the selected features, we can press the Enter key, which will start the tracking process in the terminal window, where we can see the expected remaining processing time of about 2.5 minutes. Once the tracking has completed, the options on the right-hand side of the main form will become completely available, and the information in the lower right should say that we now have 448 frames ready for image transformation. Keep in mind that no stabilized images have been created as of now, as we've only performed feature tracking. Now, there's a very good reason for that. If we click on the number of features for transformation button on the right-hand side, which now equals 5, it opens a new window. We can see the positions of our tracked features displayed on the image on the left side and listed on the right. Along with the point coordinates, there's an additional metric displayed, the average SSIM score for each of the features. Ideal value of this score is 1, and lower values indicate lower effectiveness of feature tracking. We can also display a box plot of these SSIM scores using information from each of the frames by clicking on the button on the top. Now it's even more clear that the last selected feature, which was randomly chosen, has a low score when compared to the others because that feature was not well defined in color and shape, and its tracking was very difficult. What we can do now is deselect the checkbox for feature number 5, which will also turn the color of the corresponding marker on the image from green to red. By finally clicking apply, we can see that the number of features for the image transformation is now 4 instead of previous 5. This allows us to track an arbitrary number of features and later determine which ones have been tracked with most success and use those features for the remaining steps. Below, there are some additional parameters that we can set, but we'll leave most of them at default values as these work great in most cases. The one thing we could consider changing is the transformation method. In the drop-down list are 5 different methods that we can use, and the minimal required number of features for each method to work is displayed in the parentheses. Since we now have 4 available features, we can go with either projective strict or projective optimal method. With exactly 4 selected features, the results will be the same in each case, so we can just choose either one. Now, the description of our example video also provides local coordinates of our ground control points obtained using on-site survey. If we click the Orthorectification box on the right-hand side, another form will open asking us to enter real-world coordinates of our GCPs. Keep in mind that these do not necessarily have to be the same points we've used for feature tracking. For example, we can use dozen features for motion tracking, but only use something like 4 ground control points for orthorectification. Instead, if we define coordinates for our ground control points, we'll get a chance to select those points in a separate window later on. Another thing that we must do is define the ground sampling distance, GSD, or the ratio of pixels to meters. This value is often chosen to be a nice round number to simplify later calculation, but it should also be as close to the original GSD from the original video. For that reason, there is a button labeled Measure on the right, which will allow the user to interactively measure the distance between image point and pixels and divide that value with the known real-world distance to obtain the original GSD. For example, we know that the distance between GCPs 1 and 2 is around 8.8 meters, and by right-clicking their image locations, we can see that their in-image distance is around 2100 pixels. So the original GSD is 2100 divided by 8.8, which is close to 240 pixels per meter. So a good value to use for the final GSD can be, for example, 250 pixels. Finally, we can choose how much of the ground area will be shown to the left, right, above, and below the area covered by the ground control points. We can leave this to 0, but we can also set these values to some other positive number. In this example, we can set it to 1 to get a better view of the GCPs after stabilization. By clicking on the Apply button, we can notice that the box is now checked, and the label below will indicate that the orthorectification is now configured with the use of 4 ground control points. We're now prepared to simultaneously stabilize and orthorectify the frames by clicking the button below. Since we still need to select the GCPs for the orthorectification, we'll be greeted by a window allowing us to do just that. Keep in mind that you should select the GCPs in the exact same order as they were listed in the orthorectify form. For this example, also make sure that you select the centers of the GCP markers, as these were used during the on-site survey. After the GCPs have been selected, we can just press the Enter button on our keyboard and the terminal window will appear, allowing us to track the progress of this final step. If all the tasks were completed successfully, we'll be greeted with a pop-up dialog asking if we want to review the stabilized video in frames, which we should always do. And here they are, the final results. If we open the stabilized video, we can see that the motion of the UAV and the camera was completely eliminated and that the ground control points and the water surface remain perfectly still the entire time. We can notice the black areas on the edges of the video moving as a result of the transformation of the original frames onto a new coordinate system, as well as that the video is rotated 180 degrees to conform with the coordinate system defined in the orthorectified form. This basically concludes our hands-on tutorial. Sims also comes with some additional capabilities and options like image filtering, which I will not explain in this tutorial. All of these are explained on the GitHub homepage. The following releases are planned to include complete camera calibration workflow, additional filters for preprocessing, tools for generation of local ground coordinate systems, etc. For any comments, suggestions, bug reports, and issues, you can contact me as the author of the tool on one of the emails shown or through the official GitHub repository. The tool is completely free to use, and you can reference it using the GitHub link or this research paper published by our cost action. I hope that this tutorial has helped improve your UAV image velocimetry experience, and we wish you a successful and productive campaign.